Hello everyone, thank you for joining us at this webinar on urban planning and disaster risk management. The registration for Habitat 3 is already open. We invite you to register free of charge at our webpage www.vivehabitat3.ec or at habitat3.org. We'll begin this webinar with a short introduction by a representative of Ecuador's Ministry of Urban Development and Housing. Then we will proceed to the seminar on urban planning and disaster risk management given by Drs. Sanjia Bhatia, Graham Brewer, and Captain Steve O'Keefe. After that, we will have a short one-question survey, and we will proceed with the Q&A section. You can ask your questions throughout the seminar in the chat window. We will answer them at the end. If you could just address it to whom the question is given to. Now I introduce to you Maria Cristina Gomez Jurado from the Habitat and Human Settlement Secretary of Ecuador's Ministry of Urban Development and Housing.
Hello everyone. On behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador, I welcome you to this webinar. The Ministry of Urban Development and Housing has been working for the last years in the construction of national urban policies that will help change the urban development model that has created unsustainable urban development and has fostered inequality in our cities all over the country. In this context, important events such as Habitat 3 provide us with a unique chance to fuel the discussion about the kind of cities we want and what we should do to build them. We are committed to the principles such as the right to the city, the social function of property, and to the idea that living well in the city should be for all and not only for those who can afford it. All of these principles are included in our constitution and laws. However, it's not enough to have them written down if we do not come up with strategies and means to implement them. We believe that in a country where more than 70% of the people live in cities, we can no longer delay the national debate on these issues. We have found that hosting this international meeting has awakened the interest in city planning and management in universities, among academia, among architects, engineers, other stakeholders, and the community in general. And this is a chance we mean to take full advantage of. Making cities better is a big effort, and one of the biggest challenges we face as a country is that the fastest growing cities are the small and intermediate ones, precisely the cities that lack human and financial resources that will make sustainable planning and management possible. In this context, the Ministry is working very hard to provide these cities with enough means to face the problems and the challenges of fast urbanization, especially through national legal frameworks and training programs that will strengthen their capacities. We believe that making cities better is a collective effort, so we are pleased to present this cycle of webinars which make part of a bigger context of national urban debate that we hope will help us as a country and in the construction of a national urban agenda for more equitable, inclusive, and prosperous cities for all. This sixth webinar on urban planning and disaster risk management will introduce participants to the conceptual foundations of disaster risk reduction and the Sendai Framework for DRR. It will also present examples on disaster response and on the transition to recovery. It will include examples on how to mainstream DRR principles into urban planning and on resilience building. This seminar will be held by three experts. The first expert is Dr. Sanjia Bhatia, head of the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction Office for the Northeast Asia, and head of the Global Education and Training Institute for Disaster Risk Reduction in Incheon, Republic of Korea, where over the past year he has guided the training of over 3,000 government officials. Prior, he worked as head of the International Recovery Platform Secretariat at Kobe, Japan, where he led the development of the guidance notes on recovery and trained over 850 government officials in that period. He oversees capacity building programs for national and local governments worldwide. Dr. Bhatia, your presentation can start now. Thank you very much.
We cannot hear you. I don't know if you could microphone, please. If we could just hold on a couple of seconds. There we go. Dr. Batia, you should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me now? Sorry. Good morning, good evening, everyone in Ecuador. Can you hear me?
No, we still cannot hear you. We can? Okay, perfect.
Let me try again.
Okay, perfect. We can hear you and we can see you.
Sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, okay, so there was a problem. Okay, so sorry for this. Anyway, I'll make up for the time lost. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm Sanjaya Bhatia and I represent the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and I head the Global Education and Training Institute in Incheon in South Korea, but with an outreach globally. Today I'm going to talk about building a disaster resilient world and look at some of the frameworks that are influencing this very important task, and of course focusing on the role of local governments. So let me go into the PowerPoint. I hope you can see this. Is it okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so let me start now. First, just wanted to show to you the numbers. And now these are the numbers from 2000 to 2012, but just to show the extent and the amount of damages, the number of people affected and the number of people killed. And as you can see, it's a very high number, and it is something which is gradually eroding development. So if there's $1.7 trillion in damages and 1.2 million people killed, this is going to affect and impact economic growth. So, so in a nutshell, this slide is making the cost argument for DRR, and we always must remember that DRR is not a cost, it is an investment in the future. Now, to complicate things further, we have a changing risk environment. So due to climate change, for example, the extreme events the frequency and the intensity has increased. We have urbanization all over the world, which is a good thing, but when it is unplanned, it can create more risks. We are looking at the world facing a number of governance challenges, issues of poverty, and so on. So all of these are working in tandem to increase the risk the world's population is facing, and especially in the urban areas. Now, this slide is to show a difference in two kinds of disasters we call intensive and extensive. Now, intensive disasters are what we all see on the news channels. They are well reported in the newspapers. So these are the big disasters. We are all aware of them all over the world. we always know about the big ones. So whether it be Hurricane Katrina or the Indian Ocean tsunami or the Japan earthquake or the Chile earthquake and tsunami, we all read about them in the news, or we hear them in CNN, BBC, and so on. So what sticks in our mind is that these are the real important disasters that we need to address. But what these slides are showing is that that's not so. The extensive disasters are the smaller disasters, the more frequent ones, which are repeating on a seasonal basis or are repeating on a sometimes with regular frequency, and these are actually causing more damage. So interruptions to power supply or telecom or damage to roads, it's happening more from the smaller, more frequent disasters, which we call extensive, rather than from the bigger but infrequent disasters, which we call intensive. So what we need to understand is that these smaller disasters need to be addressed, and these are happening at the local level, and they need to be addressed at the local level. And this is again a trend line of mortality and economic losses, again from the extensive risk. So extensive risk is again the smaller, more frequent disasters. And as you can see, the trend line is it's showing an increasing trend. What that means? So what it means is that we are not addressing the underlying risk drivers. So in our cities, in our local governments, there are these existing underlying risk drivers. And underlying risk drivers it's a very big umbrella. It includes not only exposure to disasters, it can also include level of education, level of poverty, level of access to health facilities, and so on, because all these can determine how vulnerable or how exposed we are to disasters. Now, keeping all this in mind, all the countries, they got together in March 2015, culminating in about 3 years of negotiations to write the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a framework with us from till 2030. So it is going to guide all of us, national governments, local governments, and other stakeholders on what we should do for reducing disaster risks. This is Sendai Framework in a snapshot, but the important point that I would like to draw your attention to is the 7 global targets. And this is the first time in the field of disaster risk reduction when the governments agreed to hold themselves accountable to targets. So this is a framework written by the governments, agreed to by the governments, signed by the governments, and now they have also agreed to the targets. So they will be reporting on these targets at a regular basis. The other important point is the 4 levels. So of course the global and regional and national is always important, but Sendai specifically made a mention of the local. So we need to re-emphasize, but also we need to understand the role of the local governments and the role of urban risk. Now, the Sendai had many innovations, and some of these include looking more at the risk. So not focusing only on what happens after a disaster, but trying to see what we can do before a disaster to reduce the impact of the disaster. So in a way, there are steps that we can take to reduce disaster risk before a disaster happens, and that will reduce our expenditure on emergency response, on recovery. So we need to look at that, and this is what the Sendai framework is saying. Also, the Sendai is talking very clearly about a shift from what to do to how to do. So no more theory, more practical. focused on the practical approaches on how to reduce disaster risk. Another important point I'll draw your attention to is the shared responsibility. So it's not just about the national governments, it's also about the local governments, it's also about the stakeholders, the private sector, the universities, academia, scientists, research organizations. Everyone has a role to play and they need to play their role. And a lot of this is spelled out in the Sendai Framework. So if you just Google Sendai Framework, you can download the document and it's available in all the UN languages, so including Spanish, and then of course Chinese, Russian, French, English. And another important point is the scope. So earlier, the Hugo Framework for Action focused more on what we call man-made. So the natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, and so on. But the Sendai Framework talks also about biohazards. So for example, epidemics. It also talks about technological disasters like industrial accidents, pipe explosions, nuclear accidents, and so on. Now, these are the 7 global targets which I was referring to earlier. 4 of them are for reduction and 3 of them are for increase. So again, very logical. It's common sense mostly. Reducing the mortality, reducing the number of people affected, reducing the economic losses, reducing the damage to infrastructure and services. So these are quite logical and intuitive. Similarly, increase the countries with national and local DRR strategies by 2020. Now this is important. This is again the role of the local governments, of the cities. This is focusing on urban risk, and everyone has agreed that they should have some DRR strategies by 2020, which is not far. And one point to be noted in this is that most urban governments and national governments already have some form of DRR legislation or regulations or strategies or action plans. They already have that. So what this means is, look at your existing plans and strategies and then align them, see the gaps, see the differences from the existing strategies with the ones that are recommended under the Sendai Framework, and then fill those gaps and align the existing strategies to the Sendai Framework. So it's not starting from scratch, it's not starting from zero. So we need to keep this in mind. Also, of course, then they want to increase international cooperation, which is also very important, not only for governments, but also for cities. Cities have an important role in sharing their experiences with other cities. And Habitat 3 could probably be a very, very good venue for that, and it will achieve that. But that's ongoing work. It has to be going on all the time. And then, of course, having access to disaster risk information assessments and so on. Now, these are the 4 priorities. So the Sendai Framework, if you look at it, it's more like a checklist. What it's saying is, if you do these, you take these steps, then you are achieving more resilience. So, and those steps or the checklist is divided in these 4 priorities. The number 1 is understanding the risk. So having the risk information available both at the government level, but also with the people and the communities and so on. Priority 2 is strengthening the governance mechanism. So this is the legislative, regulatory role of the national and the local levels. Priority 3 is about investing in risk reduction. So this is the most important, the key. If one could say that there can be a level of importance, because this is looking at ensuring that all the infrastructure or all the planning that we do for the future is risk informed. And this is very, very key, because if we manage to achieve this, then the future will definitely be safer and more resilient. And as you can see, it covers the public investment, the private investment, the economic investment, the social, health, cultural, all kinds of investments. So both the hardware, but also the software. And priority 4 is about build back better. So in case the disaster does happen, then what we need to do is examine the reasons for the disaster and try to understand what went wrong, what went right, and try to build back better, meaning look at the underlying risk factors and try to reduce them or remove them altogether in the reconstruction. Now, Sendai Framework doesn't stand in isolation, because we also have the climate agreement, we also have the sustainable development goals. So what governments have to do, both at the local level and also at the national level, is align the work that is being done for implementation of the Sendai Framework, the work that is being done for the implementation of the sustainable development goals, and the work that is being done for the climate risk. All these need to be aligned and they need to be coherent. So we need to we cannot work in silos, we need to all work together, especially at the government level. And this is very important. This is where the local governments and the national governments have such an important role, because they can do this, they can bring the coherence. And we must understand that sustainable development is the ultimate big umbrella goal. We cannot achieve sustainable development without addressing disaster risks. We cannot achieve sustainable development without addressing the climate risk. So both of these work together, and only then can we look at sustainable development. This is just to show that, disaster risk reduction is, again, it's a mix not only of the structure, because we tend to think about the structural issues only when we talk about disaster risk reduction. But there are so many non-structural measures also, the laws, the public awareness, insurance, and so many others which are not mentioned here. But just to show that when we talk about DRR, we need to talk about both. And just an example of what is being done in some countries for infrastructure, so just talking about the hardware, that they are conducting survey of facilities. They are doing the impact analysis of how these facilities, how this infrastructure will function in case a disaster happens, especially in the worst case scenario. And then they make for repairing or strengthening or retrofitting the existing structure, and also for incorporating disaster risk reduction and climate risk information into the new construction designs. And then, of course, the soft part, which is the training and the mock drills. So with these steps, it is felt that we can avoid this. And this is a picture from Kobe, from the earthquake, and you can imagine the economic loss. You can see one person standing, you see the size of this infrastructure which is collapsed. It took about 2 years to reconstruct, and Kobe was the #1 port in Japan in 2000, in 95 when the earthquake happened, and today, 2016, Kobe is still the #2 port. The economic recovery has not been possible after this earthquake. So we need to avoid this situation and build a disaster resilient world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Batia, very much for your presentation. Now I introduce to Captain O'Keefe, who has over 29 years of experience in resilience, disaster risk reduction operations, logistics, and peacekeeping operations. He is the former Chief of Staff for the Australian Defence Force Civil Military Centre and commander of its peace operations training center responsible for training of domestic and international United Nations accredited peacekeepers. He also served in the Royal Australian Navy as a maritime logistics officer at the executive, operational, and tactical levels. He is a fellow in the University of Newcastle and gives lectures in areas related to resilience, disaster risk reduction, peacekeeping operations, strategic operations, and others. Thank you very much, Captain O'Keefe. We'll start with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Steve O'Keefe and I'm from CFAL Newcastle in Australia. During this presentation, I will describe the disaster management landscape and the transition from response to recovery following a disaster. I'll also discuss the impact of disaster risk reduction on the effectiveness of a community's recovery and the concept of early recovery. The disaster management environment consists of a huge range of players from around the globe, all working to assist communities prepare for and respond to disasters. At the very centre of the disaster management landscape is the aid recipient. On average, 216 million people are affected by disasters each year. During the decade 2005 to 2015, approximately 23 million people were left homeless due to the impact of disasters. As you can imagine, government donors play a very large part in shaping the international humanitarian response to disasters. The overwhelming majority of humanitarian funding from governments comes from members of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. Private funding plays an important role in financing the collective response to meet global humanitarian needs. Estimates put contributions from major charitable trusts and foundations, businesses and corporations, as well as individuals, at $5.8 billion in 2014. Within the affected community, domestic actors such as communities, government agencies, civil society, and the local private sector are often amongst the first to respond to crises. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement comprises the International Committee of the Red Cross and the 190 national societies that are members of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. NGOs, faith-based and civil society organisations operate at the international, national and local levels. They are extremely diverse in mandate, but are often all involved in the provision of social services and assistance, advocacy and accountability. Many governments deploy their national military assets in both domestic and international contexts to assist in the response to disaster. Military actors may have superior logistical capabilities and resources, as well as the ability to respond very quickly at scale. The United Nations makes a significant contribution to the disaster management landscape in coordinating and resourcing at the global level, but also operating facilities and functions at the local level. Finally, finance and information cut across all sectors and stakeholders. The disaster management landscape encapsulates far more than just responding to an event. The disaster management cycle shown here illustrates the ongoing process by which governments, businesses, and civil society plan for and reduce the impact of disasters, but also how they react during and immediately following a disaster, and then take steps to recover after a disaster has occurred. Appropriate actions at all points in the cycle lead to greater preparedness, better warnings, reduced vulnerability, or the prevention of disasters during the next iteration of the cycle. The complete disaster management cycle includes the shaping of public policies and plans that either modify the causes of disasters or mitigate their effects on people, property, as well as infrastructure. The first step of the disaster cycle is usually considered to be preparedness. This is followed by the response, recovery, and mitigation phases. The mitigation phase of the disaster cycle is almost concurrent with the recovery phase, and its goal is to prevent the same disaster-caused damages from occurring again. In a relatively conflict-free situation, there are a number of tasks that tend to be undertaken in the response phase immediately following a major disaster. Early warning and evacuation are primarily initiatives designed to save lives. Following a disaster, an immediate priority is to carry out search and rescue operations to find trapped survivors. Whilst the people who immediately tackle this are unaffected community members, they are quickly joined by more specialised search and rescue teams. Burying the dead, and this includes not just people, but a multitude of deceased animals, then becomes an important process, one ideally taking into account accepted cultural and religious practices. The management and re-establishment of logistical routes is another critical priority, particularly as this relates both to the evacuation of affected community members and also to the delivery of vital humanitarian relief supplies. The management, coordination, leadership and information sharing then become key factors affecting the success or otherwise of an effective emergency response. To work well, many of these parameters need to have been prepared and practiced beforehand. Following a disaster, the provision of humanitarian assistance will invariably include the requirement for material and support related to health, water and sanitation, food, temporary shelter, and relief kits containing non-food items. Whilst there will be demand for initial damage and needs assessments, the optimum solution should focus on coordinated assessments involving multiple stakeholders and ideally including the affected communities themselves. In transitioning from the disaster response to the disaster recovery phase, the organisations responsible for management, coordination and information sharing may change, perhaps from an emergency response agency to a dedicated and sometimes specifically initiated authority. Clearing of the rubble and debris resulting from the disaster is an obvious and high priority, and this task can be immense in extreme situations like earthquakes, tsunamis and floods. Recovery is also the time to carry out detailed damage and needs assessments. Ideally, this process will include a combination of stakeholders, again including affected community representatives, as well as appropriate technical experts. There will be an ongoing need to provide targeted early response assistance to affected communities. The challenge here will increasingly be to strike a balance between supporting these communities, encouraging resilience, and not creating dependency. The provision of temporary accommodation and the repair, rebuilding of houses and other buildings is a complex area, and one which stakeholders such as international NGOs sometimes struggle with. Following a major disaster, the restoration of infrastructural services can be a time-consuming and invariably expensive exercise. Whilst the re-establishment of basic utilities like telecommunications, power and water can take weeks, the reconstruction of more complex infrastructure, such as the rebuilding of an industrial base or transport network, may well take months or years. In order to assist affected communities to complete the recovery process, the re-establishment of sustainable livelihoods will include a range of activities across the business, agricultural, pastoral, fishing, industrial and mining sectors. These activities range from support for individual businesses or communities up to the reconstruction of nationally important economic sectors. There is the need for the recovery process to include a range of improved disaster risk reduction initiatives, which will allow the at-risk community to be better prepared to withstand future similar natural or man-made disasters. The final parameter of the recovery stage is that of monitoring and evaluation. Whilst it is relatively easy to report on outputs, it is far more challenging to both articulate and measure the outcomes of the recovery process. This slide articulates the disaster risk management cycle for most medium to fast onset disasters such as floods, cyclones, earthquakes and bushfires. The cycle advocates that there are three main stages in any disaster, these being the normal risk reduction stage, the emergency response stage, and the recovery stage. The response and recovery tasks we have discussed in previous slides are now shown in the various risk management stages. Whilst the emergency response stage may only persist for a number of days or weeks, the recovery stage invariably lasts much longer, sometimes several years. This slide compares the normal development growth pattern, that's line number 1 towards the top of the screen, to the post-disaster growth patterns with and without disaster risk reduction, that's lines 2 and 3, respectively. The multicoloured box at the centre left of the slide lists the 5 key complementary components of effective disaster risk reduction. If these 5 complementary components work together effectively, they should be able to minimise both the likelihood of a major disaster occurring as well as its impact. Security and good governance is the first of these components and impacts the other 4. Good governance is equally as important as security, and this means confidence that financial resources will be effectively spent with the minimum of corruption or nepotism. The second major risk reduction component is that of economic and social development, particularly that with a strong emphasis on poverty reduction. This element is crucial, particularly in developing countries or emerging economies. Water and food security are growing global concerns and constitute the third complementary component. The dual challenge of water and food insecurity can lead to political and social unrest and polarisation of relationships both within and between nations. It is important for communities and nations to also both introduce and maintain environmentally sustainable practices designed to safeguard their natural environment and also combat climate change. The final component relating to effective disaster risk reduction is the combination of the 10 key disaster risk management initiatives listed in the blue box at the bottom left of the screen. Crucially, all of these initiatives or issues should be addressed in the normal risk reduction stage of the disaster risk management cycle, that is, before a potential disaster is ever faced. These initiatives include advocacy, policy and legislation, funding, organisation, risk management, planning, capacity building, information management, early warning systems, public awareness, and monitoring and evaluation. The overall focus of disaster recovery is to restore the capacity of national institutions and communities to recover from a conflict or a natural disaster, enter transition or build back better, and avoid relapses. Early recovery is a multidimensional process guided by development principles that begins in the humanitarian setting and seeks to build on humanitarian programs and catalyse sustainable development opportunities. Early recovery aims to generate and/or reinforce nationally owned processes for post-crisis recovery that are resilient and sustainable. Early recovery encompasses the restoration of basic services, livelihoods, transitional shelter, governance, security, environment, and other socio-economic dimensions, including the reintegration of displaced populations. Early recovery strengthens human security and aims to begin addressing the underlying causes of the crisis. Ideally, early recovery commences immediately after the onset of a crisis. The priorities are to produce immediate results for vulnerable populations and to promote opportunities for recovery, a response that evolves over time into longer-term recovery. This slide demonstrates how early recovery can be integrated into relief and development contexts. Early recovery and humanitarian efforts occur in parallel, but their objectives, mechanisms, and expertise are different. Early recovery efforts have three broad aims. Firstly, to augment ongoing emergency assistance operations by building on humanitarian programs to ensure that their inputs become assets for long-term development and therefore foster the self-reliance of affected populations and help rebuild livelihoods. For example, by re-establishing and facilitating access to essential services such as health, education, water and sanitation, finances, and primary infrastructure, and introducing risk reduction and conflict prevention to build back better and prevent the reconstruction of risk. Secondly, to support spontaneous recovery initiatives by affected communities and change the risk and conflict dynamics. For example, by supporting national capacity to lead early recovery planning and programming, and strengthening the self-help efforts and capacities of the affected population, especially displaced people, to contribute actively to rehabilitation and reconstruction. And thirdly, to establish the foundations of longer-term recovery, for example, by conducting early needs assessment, planning, and resource mobilisation for recovery, taking into account the different needs, resources, and vulnerabilities of affected populations, and conducting planning that involves all relevant national and international stakeholders and enables women's organisations to participate fully in all phases of recovery. In summary, the insertion of effective disaster risk reduction initiatives prior to a disaster aims to increase the rate of recovery post-disaster and increase the level of preparedness for future crises. The concept of early recovery brings the start of the recovery phase much closer to the onset of the crisis and builds on the work of humanitarian programs during the response phase. Ideally, all these recovery and disaster risk reduction initiatives will together allow the community in question to build back better and increase its resilience to prepare for, respond to, and recover from future disasters. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to continue with a presentation by Dr. Graham Brewer, who is the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Built Environment Research and associate professor at the School of Architecture and Built Environment of the University of Newcastle, Australia. He's also the director of the International Training Center for Authorities and Leaders, specialized on developing knowledge related to disaster risk management. His areas of expertise include sustainable practices in the built environment, disaster preparedness, and reconstruction. He is also leading the design and delivery of the UN's graduate programs in these areas. He has over 50 publications and research papers on urban sustainability, design for sustainability, and vulnerabilities in post-disaster reconstruction, among others.
Good day. My name is Graham Brewer and I am the Executive Director of CFAL Newcastle here in Australia. Today I would like to introduce you to the complex and interrelated issues surrounding DRR, the UN SDGs and the new urban agenda shortly to be released at Habitat 3 in Quito. In doing so, I hope to flag opportunities arising out of resilience building for cities, and also the dangers of ignoring these issues. Last year, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon declared that Sustainability starts with Sendai. In doing so, he issued a clarion call to everyone that a sustainable future for the global population, encompassing fairness and dignity for all, had to be based firstly on the reduction and ultimate removal of disaster risks. Implicit in this statement was the notion that all disasters are ultimately avoidable, that disastrous outcomes from extreme events arise as a consequence of human failure to recognize hazards, our exposure and vulnerability to them, and the risks to which we expose ourselves as a consequence. Whether the trigger to disaster comes in the form of climate or seismic, or perhaps industrial, or even geopolitical, we as humans are ultimately responsible for our own destiny. This is not simply a humanitarian argument either. Globally, people have spent over $1 trillion during the first decade of this century simply recovering and rebuilding after disasters of all kinds. Current estimates run between $200 billion to $300 billion per annum as the cost of post-disaster reconstruction. Note that this money cannot be spent on more productive outcomes, and generally it is spent on replacement of existing buildings and infrastructure. Building back better the same, if you will. UNISDR estimate the economic multiplier effect, that is, the benefit throughout the economy of such activities, to be around 1 to 1.5 times the capital expenditure, which is fine if you happen to be involved in the construction industry, but not a great comfort for everyone else. By comparison, building for resilience, Build Back Better, has been calculated to save anywhere between 3 to 7 times the reconstruction costs over the long term, thereby freeing up resources and stimulating future economic activities in 2 ways. Firstly, the social and economic infrastructure required for sustained economic growth now already exists to some extent, because it has been constructed to endure in spite of threats from extreme events. Secondly, as successive waves of extreme events cause less and less damage, the money that would have previously been spent on reconstruction is now available for investment into more productive projects, thereby allowing economic growth and increased prosperity. This is particularly important in post-disaster scenarios because, cruelly, it seems almost inevitable that the people most vulnerable to disasters are also the people with the least resources to enable them to cope. If the world's poorest populations are to climb their way out of poverty and vulnerability into a position of dignity and purpose, this can only come with increased economic activity, something that cannot occur if these people are perpetually rebuilding after catastrophes. These principles are actually enshrined in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They provide a framework for the Sustainable Development Agenda over the next 15 years. And their 17 goals, 169 targets, and associated indicators form a complex and adaptable roadmap towards the future we want for our children and their children. In essence, they express a global commitment to people in terms of poverty, hunger, health and equity, protecting the planet, the pursuit of prosperity and peace, and the centrality of partnerships as the means to achieve these goals. Sustainable Development Goal 11 talks about sustainable cities and communities, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. These are noble sentiments and build upon, amongst other things, both the Millennium Development Goals, and perhaps more importantly, the Urban Agenda from Habitat 2 in Istanbul back in 1996, which aimed to provide shelter for everyone in cities in post-conflict countries. During the intervening time, the world has changed, where some aspects of the urban development agenda have progressed, whilst others have stalled, particularly for cities in developing nations. Fast forward to 2016 and Quito, where a new urban agenda is being developed at the Habitat 3 conference. This agenda is a colossal undertaking and has been under development for many years through a structured program of consultation and draft writing. A number of zero drafts of the new urban agenda have been produced. You should have one as background reading to this webinar. And it is clear that there are key links between disaster risk reduction, the development agenda, and the importance of getting human settlement right for the 21st century. I'm conscious of time limitations, but also of the momentous significance of the new urban agenda. Accordingly, I'd like to highlight a few of the standout points. Firstly, the importance of cities is ever increasing. Over 60% of the world's population is currently located within cities, and this number is expected to rise steadily. Cities are responsible for 70% of GDP, 60% of global energy consumption, 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and also 70% of global waste. In other words, cities are great concentrations of population and economic activity, but they also cause the bulk of human impact upon our climate, upon our environment. Secondly, the new urban agenda will likely highlight the relationship between urbanization and development, which is apparent from those statistics. If cities are to become the vehicles for sustainable development, they have to be managed in a coherent and measured way. The new urban agenda will highlight the importance of development enablers and operational enablers. To explain, development enablers can be thought of as frameworks that seek to harness the multiple, often chaotic forces of urbanization in ways that can generate across-the-board growth. These would include national urban policy, laws, institutions, and systems of governance, as well as the broader urban economy. Operational enablers, on the other hand, aim to bolster sustainable urban development, or to allow it to take place at all. They are intended to result in better outcomes for patterns of land use, how a city is formed, and how resources are managed. The new urban agenda highlights local fiscal systems, urban planning, and the provision of basic services and infrastructure as the levers to such development. Thirdly, there are core ideological underpinnings to the new urban agenda, these being democratic development and respect of human rights, the relationship between environment and urbanization, equity in the face of globalization, safety and security for residents regardless of gender and age, risk reduction, and resilience building. Lastly, the new urban agenda recognizes that cities have morphed into mega regions, urban corridors, and city regions whose economic, social, and political geographies defy traditional conceptions of the city. It will recognize that irrespective of these trends in urbanization, cities and metropolitan areas are the major drivers of national economies. 2015 was a momentous year for the global community. For very important and interlinked frameworks and agreements for the future were ratified by the bulk of the world's nations. Whilst they were not mandatory, they nevertheless mapped a coherent strategy for us to build the world we want and the future we want. Habitat 3 will generate outcomes that add detail to the way forward, and in doing so will help the cities of the world, and therefore the bulk of the world's population, achieve resilient and sustainable growth. In doing so, cities will provide safe and equitable places to live with dignity and opportunity for all their inhabitants. Of course, failure to take on board the lessons learned from exhaustive research and consultation will achieve exactly the opposite outcomes, where the populations of cities live in the shadow of disaster. There will be times when the cost of doing the right thing seems prohibitive. However, the economics of business as normal produce more expensive outcomes and are ultimately high-risk gambles. In the end, it is unlikely that most cities will find all of the solutions to their resilience from within their own resources. They will necessarily need to seek help elsewhere, and this is likely to be another city somewhere around the globe. City-to-city diplomacy and commerce will therefore play an increasingly important role, as will the partnerships that are necessary to plug gaps in capability. City building, in all its forms, will become of crucial importance, and we should have started planning for it yesterday. Thank you.
On behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, we would like to thank you, Dr. Badia, Dr. Brewer, and Captain contribution to the ongoing discussions on Habitat 3. Thank you very much. Now to our attendees, a short survey will appear on your screen at this moment. Please, if you can just answer it briefly before we begin with the Q&A, just to see that everything, that the webinar has been useful for you. As well, we're going to proceed with the Q&A section. We'll begin with Dr. Sanjaya Bhatia. So if you could pose your questions in the chat window for Dr. Bhatia, we will read them and begin with the Q&A section. We'll just hold on for a couple of seconds while you answer the survey. Okay, I'm seeing some people have already posed some questions. Okay, we are going to close the survey right now. Okay, so Dr. Badia, if it's okay with you, you can unmute your microphone and I'll pose a question from Natalia Stranatko. She says, what do you think the UN should do in order to combine the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, and 2030 SDGs for implementation by member states to help them to implement all three agreements together? What challenges the UN have on this way?
Okay, thank you for the question. Very important, both from the perspective of the UN, but also from the perspective of the member states who are continually asking for coherence. So first, of course, the challenge is that working in silos. So the focal points for sustainable development, for climate agreement, and for the Sendai are different, different ministries in the governments. So within the government, they need to speak to each other, and of course within the UN all the agencies need to speak to each other. One way forward, I feel, and this has already been initiated, is through the indicators, because the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework have reporting mechanisms. So what governments are looking for, and what we all need to work together towards, is coherence in the indicators, so that the reporting mechanisms are similar, and then we don't have to repeat the information in the different reporting mechanisms. Understanding, as I said earlier also, that the Sustainable Development Goals is the big umbrella, and the climate risk and the Sendai or the DRR fits into that. You cannot attain sustainable goals without addressing DRR and climate risk. So the indicators which are developed and which the countries are adopting should be, as far as possible, coherent, so that the reporting is one line, and that will ensure that the ministries also speak to each other, and within the UN everyone speaks to each other, and the reporting is similar. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Badia. Now we have another question from Diego Puente. What are the mechanisms in order for the UN, government, and people to be articulated and have a positive DRR and response towards any disaster?
Okay, so firstly, I mean, the key mechanism is the Sendai Framework. But then, as mentioned earlier also, it does not stand alone. So it's linked with the other mechanisms which were agreed to globally last year. But the key mechanism is Sendai Framework. And as I mentioned, if you look at the document, it is basically a checklist. So, and those steps or those issues, as they are addressed, help move towards more and more resilience. At the same time, I think also there is a degree of capacity building and training that is required to unpack what is there in the SDG and the Sendai Framework and the climate agreement. That needs to be unpacked both at the national and the local level, and with the communities, so that they understand their roles and responsibilities, and they can learn practical options to be taken to implement disaster resilience and risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Badia. We have one last question from Noriel Santamaria Sanchez. Is there any UN study on reducing risks from the vernacular architectural tradition? I mean from the ancient building tradition.
I am not aware of, but I'm sure UNESCO, if you go on the UNESCO website, you might be able to find a UN study, but I'm sure there will be other academic studies reflecting on that. And it is a good point. I mean, we see an earthquake, some of the earthquake regions, we see historical structures withstanding earthquakes, and newer structures collapsing. So it is a point, a very valid point for research.
Perfect. I'm sorry I said it was the last one, but we have one from Freddy Hernán Tinajero, who just wants to know if you could please extend or talk a little bit about disaster prevention, the measures that should be taken.
Okay, so especially I would say at the local level, at the urban government level, two key tools: land use planning, building codes. These two by themselves can prevent and reduce a lot of the impacts of disasters. If land use planning is done well, and if building codes are updated, they are well informed by the risks and they are implemented properly. So I would suggest just focus on these two, and a lot of the challenges are overcome. The problem is that we see that sometimes land use planning is being improved after the disaster, so it's in hindsight. And as Dr. Brewer said, these are things which we should have done yesterday. So I would say, just focus on these two, and a lot of the problems are mitigated and prevented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Batia. Now we are going to start the Q&A section with Captain O'Keefe. Sadly, Dr. Brewer is not with us right now, so he won't be able to answer questions live, but Captain O'Keefe will be able to answer some questions for us. So if everyone could maybe in the chat pose their questions. We're just waiting to see if anybody has any questions for Captain O'Keefe. Okay, Captain O'Keefe, we have a question. It says from Freddy Hernan again. We understand that management patterns are developed. How effective are they?
That's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure about what management patterns are actually being questioned there. But I guess when we're looking at management, when it comes to from response to recovery, there's going to be management at a number of levels. There will be local, and those are going to be those who have been impacted. There will be regional, and then there will be national, but also international. And I guess the management right through all these participants in the disaster management and the disaster risk management cycles will all have their ingrained lessons and their ingrained ways of managing. And I guess if we want to bring recovery closer to the onset of the actual disaster, it will mean a change, I guess, in mindset, and also a change in the traditional management patterns, not only post-disaster, but also pre-disaster, because you remember that that cycle starts prior to an event, encapsulates the event itself and the response, also the recovery, and then the mitigation leading into more preparedness. So a good question about management patterns that really says that by communicating, I think, between all the key stakeholders, by various members of, say, academia, science, and locals, all conducting dialogue to understand what happens before and afterwards, and also acknowledging the lessons that come out of disasters, but not only acknowledging them, but actually implementing them, so they're lessons learnt, not just lessons acknowledged. I think over time, as there's greater dialogue between all the stakeholders in the disaster management landscape, and also an awareness of the benefits of early recovery, then habits and the management expectations will change over time. I guess the problem is, and Dr. Brewer talks about this, that disaster risk reduction investment is not sexy. However, investment in disaster response attracts funding from many individuals, corporations, governments from around the planet, because people see the suffering and the damage from disasters in the media, television, newspapers, on social media. And so unfortunately, that attracts more funding and more interest, even if it's only in the short term, from around the globe. And unfortunately, trying to convince people that investment in disaster risk reduction is worthwhile is going to be difficult. But it will be frameworks like Sendai and also the Sustainable Development Goals that I think will bring about that change in management patterns as the dialogue increases around the globe.
Okay, thank you very much, Captain O'Keefe. We have another question. Is there any international experience on how to shift from what to do to how to do?
There is an interesting case study from the Gorkha earthquake in Nepal in 2015. And although it was only written in about the first 5 months after the earthquake, the case study indicates that because there had been some disaster risk reduction and a number of national plans implemented prior to the disaster itself, that recovery was able to be started earlier. I think it's also worth noting that in 2005, there was an early recovery cluster started, and the United Nations Development Program is the cluster lead for early recovery. And so there is going to be, over time, more information and more information sharing between the humanitarian programs and also the recovery and development, sustainable development programs. If you're aware of the success of the other clusters in disaster response, having a cluster for early recovery hopefully will have the same impact about bringing the key stakeholders together in a timely manner to share information, to share lessons learned, and to change practices and implement those changes for the next time. There was also another case study from the Philippine typhoon Haiyan in November 2013, and they indicated that after a year they could see some signs that early recovery was occurring, but more work was needed. So in 2013 they indicated that there were some movements in the early recovery, and that was in the Philippines. And in Nepal they could see greater improvements with early recovery starting closer to the onset of the disaster. And so in time I think that will improve, and we'll see more case studies from disasters and contemporary disasters where the humanitarian programs are starting to overlap with the sustainable development programs. And again, I say that the UN cluster lead, being UNDP, will also lead this for future disasters in both preparedness, response and recovery.
Thank you very much, Captain O'Keefe. We have more questions, but sadly we are running out of time. We're already 15 minutes over time, so we won't be able to answer all the questions. On behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, we would like to thank you for attending this webinar. And after the webinar closes, a window will open up on your screen with a short questionnaire, which will also be sent to you by mail tomorrow. Please, if you can fill it out to receive the certificate of participation. Also on your screen, we invite you to register for Habitat 3. Registration is free of charge, and we would like for you to come to Quito and be able to register for the conference Habitat 3. Also on August 16th and 17th, we will have a new set of webinars on urban housing and transport. You can register at our webpage or at UNITAR's webpage, the same place where you register for these webinars. Thank you and good evening or good day, depending on where in the world you are. And thank you again to Dr. Brewer, Dr. Batia, and Captain O'Keefe.